Welcome, everyone. Welcome and good evening. My name is Dr. Keith Jones.
And I'm Dr. Tony Vandermeer.
We teach in the Africana Studies Department here at UMass Boston. And we want to thank you for gathering with us in community and participating in a very important dialogue this evening. We want to thank the Sustainable Solutions Lab here at UMass Boston, especially the director, Rebecca Hurst, and her exceptional team. Additionally, we want to thank the leadership of the Africana Studies Department, former chair, Dr. Kabibi Mac Shelton, and current chair, Dr. Jemadare Kamara, whose continuous support has been crucial to our work over the past 2 years. We also want to acknowledge that UMass Boston is on the traditional homelands and home waters of the Massachusetts people, a community who is still very much with us today as the Massachusetts Punkapoag tribe. And we also want to acknowledge that we all share a common ancestry with Africa, which we must recognize in order to name the exploitation of African labor and the crime and inhumanity of enslavement. The Sankofa Conversation Series on structural racism was designed as a platform to hold space for honest and authentic dialogue. We saw these conversations as an important initial process for uplifting the concerns of people of color, women, and other marginalized groups across campus. By initiating these conversations, we hope to begin to make manifest a real experience of democratic citizenship, thereby shifting our campus culture to one inclusive of the needs, the input, and the voices of those historically harmed by the policies and practices of this institution. Throughout the Sankofa conversations, we centered a restorative justice approach, focusing on addressing harm and injury in order to repair it. Tony.
Thank you, Keith. For us, engaging in substantive and collaborative conversations remains foundational to the process of transforming our campus culture. We were and are guided by the belief that calling in, as opposed to calling out, is necessary to build the kind of trust that a true cultural shift requires. For instance, if shared governance is to emerge and become operational on our campus, then we must truly respect the contributions, the experiences, and the dignity of our entire campus community. We must show reciprocity and practice equity in concrete, material ways in the form of budgets, planning, and policies that affect staff, students, tenured and non-tenured faculty. Performative and rhetorical gestures alone will not put in place a campus community governed by the principles of democratic citizenship. As a result of our commitment to holding spaces for necessary dialogue, we have collaborated with the Sustainable Solutions Lab to explore how issues of structural racism inform and impact the environmental disasters and climate catastrophes we are increasingly encountering across our planet. Unprecedented fires, flooding, bomb cyclones, hurricanes, droughts, and severe weather events are happening with greater frequency and intensity. According to a recent report, microplastics, long known to be accumulating in our environment, now contaminates our very blood. Moreover, the impacts of these planetary crises affect the most historically vulnerable communities, Black and Brown communities, formerly colonized peoples in nations of the global South, women, people experiencing poverty, queer, trans, and gender expansive peoples, peoples with disability, and Indigenous and Native peoples. Our panelists this evening enable us to enter into a dialogue that will help us trace these global and intimate connections between structural racism and climate justice. Unfortunately, Naima Muhammad won't be with us because of family matter, but we're honored to have Myriam Dondzina, Robin Kelley, and Dr. Robin Kelley and Meer Johnson here with us this evening to enable the campus and our broader communities in a continued Sankofa conversation that seeks not only to name the harm, but to think collectively, and so that we can act collectively to bring about the repair and healing we urgently need. Keith?
Thank you, Tony. We now want to introduce Myriam Dondzina, who is the Associate Director of the Cities Network at the Nature Conservancy. She will be helping us to frame our discussion this evening, and we are very, very grateful to have her here. Myriam.
Greetings and good evening or good afternoon, depending on where you are. Yes, thank you for allowing me to be here and for that tremendous opening. Thank you for the acknowledgements, Keith, and for the orientation, Tony, Dr. Jones, Dr. Vandermeer. Thank you. I think it speaks to your tremendous organizing effort that we have over 100 people, over 120 people joined here. So I just want to take a moment and appreciate everyone who's taken the time to show up for yourselves and to tune into one another. I invite you to uncross your legs and put your feet on the ground and connect with whatever earth is underneath you and take a deep breath. This is hard work and it's important lessons that we will be able to unpack, I think, over the years of our work. I always like to start there. I also want to mention in terms of the idea of Sankofa that I am the third Dondzina in my family. I am an embodiment of the women who have come before me, of my grandmothers and my mothers, and I am the embodiment of the men who have come before me, my grandfathers and my fathers, who have helped me to become the person that I am. So any missteps, are mine, but any wisdom certainly has come from them. So I appreciate the Sankofa framing, the idea that we go back and we fetch. We reconnect, we remember, we reimagine, we recreate. I mean, obviously there is no new material to create from, right? Just new iterations of what life is like on this planet. And we want it to be sustained and we want it to be healthy based on the legacy of our actions and the work that we do. So as we think about the past, one of the things that we probably can agree on is that no one is an expert about the future. So we all have things that we know, and we all have things that we have learned along the way. And there are valuable lessons to be learned from the past as we envision the shape of things to come. And despite much uncertainty about the world that we will be walking into, many people agree that urgent action is needed to protect the planet and her people. So how do we deal with that global complexity of many competing priorities and bring greater clarity and accountability to our work? And how do we, in our various stories that we tell, convey a vision of the future that is so compelling and so comprehensive that we want to be there and we want to work to get there together, the possibility of what is to come. So how do we move from ideas to inspired action? I definitely pull from the stories of my mothers and my grandmothers to help me imagine what the future might be. And I know that our work is shaped by the stories we remember and retell about ourselves and who we are and what our purpose is. So I appreciate my fellow panelists, Mama Mia, even Mama Naima, knowing that she won't be here, just presencing her, and Dr. Kelley, who I really enjoyed the Freedom Dreams book that he wrote and what I learned from it. So, I've said a little bit about who I am and who I'm here in an official capacity representing is more people than I can name. And I work for the Nature Conservancy. I'm the Deputy Cities Network Director, and we have iterated and tested intersectional and equity-focused approaches working in cities across the United States. We know, unfortunately, that it is not a thing of the past. It is not simply the past, but our current reality, and one that our children will undoubtedly face as the deeply rooted inequities that persist across Black, Indigenous, and communities of color, the social and political structures, such as redlining, that have created and driven systemic inequity have also made it so that these communities bear a disproportionate burden of negative environmental and climate change impacts. And due to structural racism, communities and neighborhoods primarily home to migrant workers and the working poor poor are often on the front lines exposed to poor air quality and water quality and are the least protected from flooding and extreme heat, resulting in health and environmental crises. And these realities often stem from the inequitable implementation of planning and policy, and race still is the #1 indicator of the location of toxic facilities, leading to adverse health and well-being outcomes for these communities. This is not simply a story of poor me or poor us, but an idea that these impacts actually reduce the quality of life and lower the life expectancy of people in cities. And we know that this reality is not confined exclusively to cities, because globally, as climate change impacts cascade across various continents, we see those people on the continent of Africa, in Asia, in Latin America, and the Caribbean, and many island countries, many island nations who are the first to be impacted and the least to be contributing. So we have a lot of work to do. And part of how we do this work is through learning. You know, we cannot do what we do without learning about what's possible. You know, so we appreciate the scholarship and the leadership and the mentorship and the guidance that comes by way of those who have come before us. There is a saying that I learned while I was doing research with riverside communities in the Amazon. It's a saying I learned that you cannot defend what you don't love, and you can't love what you don't know. And so as we approach work that has to do with climate adaptation or mitigation, or, you know, undoing racism, addressing structural racism, and all of these things require us to actually become familiar with each other and with the communities that we serve and work in service of. There's things coming in the chat. I was getting distracted. So I'm thankful for this opportunity to get to know each other, and I am more dialogue or discourse based, and I appreciate my community for always asking me to step up, and I learn a lot in my conversations with my colleagues, with my communities, and I have learned a lot in my conversations with Dr. Vandermeer and Dr. James. I think that an inclusive way forward requires systemic change. How do we get to systemic change? We start with ourselves, because profoundly changing ourselves and the way that we work with our teams will have tremendous impacts beyond our expertise. It is our heart, it is our earth grounding practices that actually bring us to be able to connect more authentically and more fully with one another. And once we connect, we can build community, and then we can get to the systems that need to be changed. But we don't change them without changing ourselves. You know, so we have a lot to learn. We understand that there are multiple pressures on our communities and interconnected risks. So the more we learn about each other and how we can work together, the more we can do in ways that are efficient and effective. And we have a lot to learn. And I'm going to keep saying that because I, most of all, have a lot to learn. I am always reflecting on the importance of being present, and being thoughtful, and being humble, and being driven, and being determined, and using my voice and my actions to change what I can, when I can, and mostly holding space for us to care about and support one another, because this work is not a race, and it is not for the swift, but those who can endure. And can we do it? Yes, we can. I believe that we can. We can do it, and we shall do it, as I've heard said, because we will do that work on ourselves. That's why we showed up today. We will do that work in relationship to one another, and with our communities. And because of that, those cascading impacts that we see that are the negative, the losses, you know, the climate change, you know, and reduction of resilience will be transformed. We do this work because we believe in the outcomes that are possible, and we believe that we can create a better future for us and for our children, for the earth that sustains us, and we can do so in a way that has impacts beyond what we can imagine. So I appreciate you. I appreciate the Sustainable Solutions Lab, and for all of you who attend, who are in attendance this evening, because I believe that it represents your commitment to change and your commitment to doing what you can and learning what you can to affect all that you can. So thank you. I look forward to learning Dr. Kelley and Mama Mia, and the rest, I will turn it back over to you.
Thank you, Myriam. We'll now enter into the first round of our discussions this evening with Mia Johnson, who is a divestment campaigner for the Indigenous Environment Network, and also Dr. Robin D.G. Kelley, who is Distinguished Professor and Gary B. Nash Endowed Chair in U.S. History at UCLA. Again, we will place their longer biographies in the chat. We want to reiterate how appreciative we are to have all of you here this evening. So for all of you in the audience, please put any question you have in the Q&A, and we hope to have time to end at the end to discuss them. So I'm going to begin first with a question to Mia Johnson. So Mia, you have extensive experience as an organizer and activist in Black and Native communities. How does your organizing and activist work connect restorative justice, restorative structural racism, and climate justice?
Hi, yes, thank you. Hi, everybody. Good evening. So I think that one of the things I want to kind of go back and thank you so much, sister, for sharing such a broad overview of the work that we have before us, the work that we here are all part of. And I know many of you that are here viewing tonight are substantially a part of this work. Again, my name is Mia Johnson. I use she, they pronouns. I live in so-called Boston on Wampanoag territory, Wampanoag territory. And I just want to honor the fact that I am here by way of their stewarding of the land for over 500 years. That if they hadn't been here and they haven't continued to be here and remain, that we, in fact, would not be here in the ways that we are, and the continued struggle for justice. So opening with that, to go into just wanting to talk about some of these terms that we're using and describing and thinking through in both the work that I do at IN, as well as the work that I have done organizing in communities in the Boston and the Northeast area. So we talked that, words that we're using are, restorative justice, structural racism, and climate justice. And they're different concepts. They're not the same. They're not one and the same. And I want to make sure that when I'm speaking about them, that I'm really clear the distinctions. So restorative justice is a process, one inherited from Indigenous peoples around reconciliation, bringing back together, making whole, right? So I think it sits really well in the terms of Sankofa, of looking back to go forward, but also holding that within community. And then practicing justice, finding the accountability, finding the way through, finding the apology. As a community, as a structure, not just solely as an idea, but as a structure that has a practice that enables mending to take place. So when I'm speaking about potential ways in which this work can go forward, that is the part of what I'm lifting up. Looking at structural racism, another concept that it is not just the systemic structure and the idea of it, but the impact of it, right? So that's the structural part of it, is the impact of the racism, the impact of the idea of the perception, right? Because the race is based on the perception of the way people see other people and each other within the world, and how that impact harms them and how it's uplifted through structures within society, and how the society maintains those structures in order to maintain power and control over other people, right? So it's about domination, it's about taking over and steering. And in climate justice, one of the challenges is that people will talk about environmental justice and climate justice, and they're not interchangeable. They're different concepts. And so I want to pull that out and really speak to climate justice as a term. A lot of times, the way that climate work has happened is that it's happened through a lot of folks with a lot of privilege that have had time to, that have the time and ability to not have to be concerned with a direct frontline fight. The communities that we work with in Indigenous Environmental Network are Indigenous communities who are on the front lines of these fights. The communities that I've worked with within Boston and the greater Northeast area are communities that are on the front lines of dealing with the harmful impacts of climate change and the structural impacts of these changes. So similarly, without having communities, so climate is, you can fight climate, but have justice within it means that you're actually taking leadership from the front line or the grassroots of those most impacted by the harm of the climate chaos, and their leadership in directing how that fight is done and how that fight is won. So I like to make sure that when I'm sharing the concepts and ideas, especially when they're quite big and cover a lot of notions, that we kind of can begin somewhere in the same place, or at least you know where my beginning is at. So when I'm doing my work, and when I've done my work, and my colleagues that are doing this work around bringing these three concepts together to create change, right? And to create structural change, it's to look at who is leading, is to answer these questions. Who's harmed? Who's leading? What is their practice to create the change? Where is the question of transformation? Not just simply organizing, but what needs to be transformed, and who is in the process and agreement to transform? And is there, and what is that, what does it lead, what is the possible pathway that it leads to, right? So who is harmed, and I mentioned that within climate justice, is looking at the communities most impacted by the harm of climate change, right? Those most impacted, and they're impacted, if you follow the line back, through structural racism, right? There's a notion and a concept that is a living idea. It's a living thing that happens and is happening within our concept of the world right now, right? And it doesn't mean that it's right. It means that it's happening. There's not a denial that it's happening. So structural racism has impacted those who are most impacted by climate change, right? Those who are most impacted by that. So when people are thinking about how do we fight for the climate, for many years, the climate fight was held and looked at as a fight being held by mostly privileged suburban white people. And they were lobbying and doing policy work and advocating, sometimes on behalf of a community, sometimes not. And it doesn't necessarily mean that they were coming from a bad way. It does mean that they were coming from a way where they hadn't been engaged in a conversation around structural racism or a conversation around justice within the climate movement. Because justice means that we're listening to those most impacted. And I want to go back to that. Those most impacted are those who are immediately at the line of the harm. So when we look at a pipeline, who is immediately harmed by that pipeline? Not who will be eventually, or not how it could eventually maybe hurt somebody, but who immediately is harmed by that? When a dam is being built or reconsidered or reconstructing, who's immediately being harmed by that? When there's a bus depot being put into a city or being reevaluated and air quality needs to be evaluated, who in that community is being most harmed? Also, where are they building it, right? Where are they building the pipelines? Where are they making decisions to build the bus depots? Where are they making decisions to build and create spaces where those people nearby, based on science, can be and will probably be harmed? That's the structural racism part. The justice within climate is for those folks who are going to be harmed or who are harmed, having the ability to lead and the support to direct that fight, right? The fight for their right to live with dignity, to live with their full humanity, and to be able to mend that which has harmed them, right? So, and that can look a lot of different ways. And so the transformative part, the transformation that happens in the justice is the mending. So when you have been able to identify, here's a climate issue, here's the justice issue, we've identified a community within this structure that has been harmed by structural racism. You know, there's policy, laws, corporations, write-offs, all these things that are happening, you know, that allow this to happen, that have created the context for this to happen. And this community has said, no, no more, we're not going to do it. This is how we're determining our own self-determination within this, begins this process of restorative justice. Whether it's actually recognized in that moment that that's what's happening, the transformation and the restoration begins to happen when a community stands on its own and says, no more, right? No more, I'm not going to do it anymore. When it becomes a formal process is when you begin to bring everyone to the table and say, okay, we've made a mistake, we've screwed up, we've allowed structural racism to happen, we've removed justice from the climate fight. We're going to put those things back in and we're going to learn how to do it together, and we're going to transform what that means. And sometimes that means that there is an allocation of funding. Sometimes what that means is there's a stopped work to the process of what's being built. Sometimes that means that there's a policy change and an enactment that the lead of that enacting and how it rolls out is led by the community that's most impacted. Sometimes that means that there is a transfer of land, transfer of property to those communities that have been harmed, right? So there's a lot of different ways that can happen. And then there's also, and so I'm being very broad because each of these fights is very different, and I've been a part of several of them. And so it's quite wide. And to do this work without people being connected to this conversation really keeps the work in a notion framework, right? So if you're only talking about climate, you're only talking about the notion of climate, not its impact on human beings directly, not its impact on folks who are experiencing the harm, and not its impact on the generations to come, right? Or the impact of those who have already experienced harm, which is often the case that many of the communities that have been targeted today have consistently been targeted because of structural racism, settler colonialism, and white supremacy systems. So it's not a new idea that this has happened. So I want to wrap up with that and just understand and reiterate more than once that the most important thing I hope that you can hear from me tonight is that it is essential that those, however you want to name it, whether it's frontline, grassroots, most impacted, that they lead this fight. Those who are experiencing the harm, have experienced the harm, are in midst of experiencing the harm, have the most knowledge about how to fix it, have the most know-how. They may not have all the resources, they may not have all the tools, but they know how to fix it because they live there and they experience it, and they know how to lead to take care of themselves and build the possibility of something new. And that's what we want, is a possibility of building something new and mending the harm that has happened. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Mia. And thank you, Myriam, for grounding us in the way that you did so beautifully and eloquently a moment ago. And you know how sacred, Mia, to me, this notion of mending is. And I appreciate how carefully and how intelligently and powerfully you elucidated the different kinds of dimensions of what it is that we need to be attentive to as we move forward and work collectively to do the kind of mending that is required of us. I want to turn now and bring Myriam back into the panel. And I want to ask you, Myriam, if I may. So given your involvement with a national network of people engaged in environmental and climate work, based on your institutional experience, what are the challenges that you see in making the connections between structural racism and environmental and climate justice? In many ways, just an extension, please, of your really insightful and rich comments earlier.
Yes, thank you. So, some thoughts. One is that where we sit isn't always where we have sat. You know, my work started in communities, teaching everything from art to gardening, to farm to school, and definitely have worked in my own community to do a lot of programming, empowerment, and supporting youth and elders. That's really where my perspective starts. And where I sit in the Nature Conservancy actually represents a profound opportunity. So some of the framing, I think I really resonate with what Mia says about terminology and being intentional about what we mean when we say certain words, and for our ideas and our concepts to be elucidated through practice and to be accessible in general. So in terms of my experience with environmental and climate work institutionally, in this network that I have been a part of for the past 7 years, and in the space that I currently sit, there are obviously many, many challenges. And one of them comes from our need to continue to learn and be in dialogue. This concept that I bring from the Amazon about you cannot defend what you do not love, and you cannot love what you do not know. There are many times when we're thinking about the scale of something like a city or a state or a country or region, an ecosystem where we can't know everything, and we will have gaps and we'll have blind spots. And I think that that really requires that we be willing to be humble and sit at the table and listen and learn. Many of the challenges, in fact, are institutional, right? So like based on my institutional experience, what are the challenges? Many of those are institutional, and the institutions can be formal or informal, meaning it can be a nonprofit organization, or it can be an institution of, white supremacy, like these things that become indoctrinated and memorialized that frame how we think and what we do. And I will say that there are many opportunities for how we are able to work with the cities network, and doing that work represents some of the challenges. So what do I mean? I mean that in our network, over 7 years now, we have continued to build with communities, listen, come attend community meetings, talk to people sitting on their couches in their neighborhoods, and then bring what we learned to our conversations and bring our conversations to those tables. And a lot of the work is translational. People don't speak the same language, even if it's the same, English or Spanish or Portuguese or French. It's not the same articulation of ideas. And many times it's not even the same cosmology. So we're not even looking at the same world based on the way we think about what do the trees and the rivers and the oceans actually represent to us in terms of the embodiment of different energies on this planet. And so we have to translate that into institutional project plans and budgets, working across a network of people who are building relationships with their own communities and with one another. And it takes time and it takes patience. It takes a willingness to resolve conflict that is hard for us to do as a people. It takes a willingness to admit what you don't know and to be guided through a process of learning and exploring. So I'll tell a story that's really close to my heart in relation to my work that illustrates this. So I worked in Atlanta building an urban conservation program as part of the development of this network. This story is not dissimilar to many of the stories of our colleagues across the network, and I want to tell it because it's personal. So after spending many months in research mode, learning and studying and reading and talking to people and attending meetings and doing demonstration projects, I found myself on the couch of Dr. James L. Booker, who was a retired police officer from the city of Atlanta, one of the first African Americans to have desegregated his community in South Atlanta, which through redlining led to white flight and disinvestment in those communities. And James Booker, along with many of the other neighbors, had organized over decades through the Thomasville Heights Civic League many programs to do their own work, to get the streets paved, to get the garbage picked up, to get the community beautified, to all kinds of things, to attract business, to attract the support of the local politicians as the appropriate stewards of where they lived in their community. In his retirement, he was looking for a way to really reflect on the work that he had done. And we agreed to put in mailbox pollinator gardens in the homes of senior citizens the elders of that community, both in a way that benefited nature and people, and seems really underwhelming to put in mailbox pollinator gardens. And we're thinking about these global climate challenges, but like I believe very strongly the solutions start closer to home, and they start, in our front yards and in our backyards and in our parks and in our communities. So that led to exploring the possibility to develop a program working with another organization, Habesha, which is an organization called Helping Africa by establishing schools at home and abroad. And through our work, we were able to develop an urban green jobs program, working with others in the community to bring in financial literacy, challenging oppression and healing from the wounds of oppression training, and everything from planting trees to removing invasive species, and on and on and on and on. A month-long immersion in learning that led to an internship and then jobs for the people in that program. I'm very proud to have been a contributor, and translating that and supporting it and sustaining programs like that over time comes with facing funding challenges. Like the sister said, the people in the community know what they know, and they know what they need, and they don't always have the resources, and it's just our job to advocate on their behalf. Contracts and operations, operationalizing equity in the way that we think about what does it mean to create an internal departmental approach that's less risk averse in the way that institutions might imagine it, and more transformational. It is hard, and it takes speaking to our role to advocate on behalf of communities. And so much of our challenge is institutional. We need to rewrite SOPs. We need to recreate team norms. We need to think about how we approach planning and who we involve, and if our plans actually speak to the adaptation needs of the people that we believe ourselves to be serving. And all those blind spots, I think, are challenges that we will not get right. But I have a very strong belief in not letting the perfect be the enemy of the good. So I believe that our children can be brought into this. My daughter, who's 5, she asked me to share a few words with you. And she was like, I think you should tell them that if they don't care about the trees, they don't care about themselves. And if they don't care about themselves, they don't care about the trees. And I was like, that's brilliant, because we are the earth and we ground in ourselves as we do this work. And so how do you translate that into institutional theories of change and project plans and timelines and budgets? It's mechanical, it's technical, and a lot gets lost in translation. And it is important for us to continue to speak up, to use our voice, and to empower those around us. I'm thankful for, I just want to presence the members of the Cities Network and their partners who have helped them learn about how we center not ourselves, but equity in the work that we're doing, justice. And we will not get it all right. And we still have work to do. Thank you.
Thank you, Myriam, and also thank your professor daughter for the wisdom, and also thank you, Amaya. We're going to go next to Dr. Robin Kelley, and I'm sure that Robin, you've heard with Meer as well as with Myriam, as well as Myriam's daughter, of what they said. And as someone who has been working in the academy themselves, and as a historian who have long written about issues of race, gender, and class, how can you help us to understand the longer histories that connect with the present climate emergencies and the issues around environmental justice and structural racism?
Right. Well, thank you so much, Tony, for the question. And by the way, Myriam, I love that that line from your daughter. Jane Cortez has this beautiful poem where she talks about the women as trees, and I would suggest listen to that. It's very, very powerful. In any case, all the work that you're doing is amazing. I am speaking to you from unceded territory of the Tongva people here in a building named after Ralph Bunche. I'll let you think about that and Ralph Bunche's role in the creation of modern Israel on Palestinian land, but that's another story. So as Mia put it, we have been in the line of harm for a very long time, I would say 500 years. And so to answer your question, Tony, I mean, the source of the climate catastrophe is clearly colonialism and racial capitalism, which is why I tend not to use terms like anthropocene, but the more accurate description is a racial capitalocene. That is a crisis created by a parasitic class whose power was built on genocide, land theft, slavery, white supremacy, heteropatriarchy, the carceral state, labor exploitation, and unbridled resource extraction. Climate catastrophe, for example, cannot be disentangled from the kind of neoliberal policies that cause displacement, migration, insecurity, the debt crisis, currency devaluation, and the deregulation of environmental and labor standards. So, like I'm here in California, the neighboring nation, of course, is Mexico. Free trade policies, notably NAFTA and the Caribbean Basin Initiative, allowed for a lot more foreign investment, for things like prohibiting the nationalization of industries. This is what the Zapatistas were fighting over. Promoted the creation of industrial slums, these maquiladoras, lower wages, deforestation, and the use of chemical fertilizers, all contributing to pollution and environmental havoc, which in turn, of course, stimulates more desperate migrants. The US then responds with increased border militarization and wall building, which of course accelerates environmental destruction. So we have to talk about the militarization of the world is also a source of environmental destruction. And I haven't even talked about how, the warming water and hotel development and golf courses and commercial fruit plantations all discharge sewage into the sea, and all this devastated the fishing industries off the coast of Mexico. But in terms of the long history that you talk about, I just want to give one example, because it's always good to use really concrete historical examples to illustrate what I mean when I say colonialism is a source. We think about, for example, Hurricane Katrina and its devastating impact in southern Louisiana as a kind of natural disaster or even a man-made disaster. Sometimes we think of it as sort of recent, but it's centuries in the making. It's a product of the colonial order. So as both speakers talked about, before settlers, indigenous people, were the ones who were the caretakers, the stewards of the land. So in southern Louisiana, had a very dynamic ecosystem, swampland, for at least a couple of thousand years. The Chitimacha people cultivated corn, squash, potatoes. They fish. They understood the river's natural flood patterns, not just the Mississippi, but Atchafalaya rivers. Europeans come along, introduce a plantation system driven by kidnapped African labor, introduce steamboats, turn the port city of New Orleans into the global center of capitalism, and the production and global trade in cotton, sugar, and human beings meant massive deforestation, clearing of forests, industrial agriculture based on single crops, more boats, more steamboats, which meant more levees and more canals and more flooding and ecological changes to the wetlands, the clearing and dredging of marshlands and the construction of even more canals bolstered the commercial lumber industry, which of course is more deforestation. And we know the impact it has. It promotes climate change, since trees capture greenhouse gases, and prevent these gases from accumulating in the atmosphere. So beginning around the late 1920s, around the time of the Great Flood of 1927, which displaced thousands of Black families, they discover oil and natural gas, in southern Louisiana, and begin to extract it. in and around the wetlands. So by the late 30s, the area becomes a major site for drilling, seismographic activities, pipeline construction. And today, this section where there's oil and natural gas is, between New Orleans and Baton Rouge, is home to 125 oil and chemical plants. The corridor is known popularly as Cancer Alley. And you can guess who lives there, right? Black and Indigenous communities. More canals were dug, cypress trees destroyed, wildlife disrupted by fossil fuel extraction, and the rise of the petrochemical industry led to the construction of something we don't always talk about. That is, if you go down to New Orleans, you'll see something called the Mississippi River Gulf Outlet, the MRGO. Massive, multi-billion-dollar artificial channel, which was created to shorten the navigation route for oil tankers and other commercial ships between the Port of New Orleans and the Gulf of Mexico, which literally wiped out most of the city's cypress swamp wetlands, which served as a kind of natural storm buffer. What are the consequences? Well, when Hurricane Betsy hit in '65, MRGO was like a funnel. It's like a storm funnel that aimed at predominantly Black and low-income communities in the lower Ninth Ward, and salt water from the Gulf of Mexico flowed into the channel, further destroying several hundred square miles of wetlands, forests, estuaries, devastating the seafood and shellfish industry. And most of the debris ended up where? In the agriculture street landfill, which turned a Black neighborhood into a Superfund site. This is all before Katrina. So MRGO is a reason why during Hurricane Katrina, St. Bernard Parish in the lower Ninth Ward experienced the worst flooding precisely because the channel literally intensified storm surges. So, we could talk about conspiracy theories and the, Army Corps of Engineers blowing up the levees, but you don't have to do that. The whole system of extraction, capitalist extraction in southern Louisiana, produced the conditions for the devastating impact of Katrina. And so that story that I tell could be replicated all over the global South. So that's just one example of when we talk about the long history of racial capitalism and colonialism, that's what we have to pay attention to, because there's a direct connection between, say, the demand for reparations, the dismantling of capitalism, decolonization, and attending to the climate crisis. So I'll stop there.
Thank you. Thank you, Robin. I find myself given this really just brilliant chronology that you just supplied us with, thinking about something that the Chickasaw poet Linda Hogan says, which is, whatever happens to the land happens to the people, right? That deep sort of imbrication and implication of these longer histories, because one of the things that's animated a lot of the work that Tony and I have been doing recently as well is just thinking about how long unfolding this apocalypse is, right? And this is one of the reasons why I think, and maybe this is a subject for another conversation, but one of the reasons why we actually really do need to be very, very clear about our objection to the Anthropocene, right? And the notions of the human that actually have contributed to the production of the crisis that has been long unfolding. And this topography that you give in New Orleans, especially with respect to the relentless and violent capitalist extraction, this is the long history of Cancer Alley. And Cancer Alleys exist in so many places. And that's why this sort of toxicity is just a thing that we really have to name in order to be able to heal. So if I can turn back to you, if I may please, and ask, given that we know these long histories have produced these unfolding crises in the way that they have, and given also how profoundly distributive they are, unevenly, but distributed and diffuse, what kinds of solutions have you encountered, are you seeing, might you propose that address these interrelated issues? This is part of the work that we all need to talk about as well and hold the space for, is to think about how we collectively move forward. And I want to think about what Mia was saying and hold the space for thinking about the mending.
Right,
so please.
Right. It's a hard question, and yet at the same time, Mia is absolutely right. The people on the front lines have the solution. So all I could do is share some examples of what I know is happening. One is, at the forefront of these struggles are Indigenous communities that are fighting not just, pipelines, but protecting sacred lands and protecting water, estuaries, aquifers, everything. But to make the argument that we have to protect sacred lands is to make a case for sovereignty. You see, so it's a political question as well, and it is a moral and ethical question, but it's also a legal question. So these nations have never given up their sovereignty, and so to say that we need to preserve sacred lands is not to make the case that surfers need to have surf, or white people need to be comfortable. Is to say we need to give up the claim to this. That is decolonization. So we continue to resist pipelines and oil and gas extraction, keep it in the ground. We have to be internationalists. If the crisis is planetary, we need to mobilize on a planetary scale. I was thinking recently of the farmer strike in India, the largest strike, 250 million people in history, launched in 2020, which opposed legislation by the Modi government to liberalize trade to benefit multinational agribusiness and commodity traders like Walmart, Cargill. I think about the work of the Red Nation, for example, which put out this amazing manifesto called The Red Deal, which I would suggest everyone read, which makes a very clear argument that the only way to attack the climate catastrophe is decolonization and ending capitalism. And I won't go into what's the details in the document because there are many, but some of their arguments or their demands are things that we don't think of as environmental, but they're very much environmental. That is, reinstate treaty rights, end disciplinary violence against Indigenous and oppressed peoples, which means abolishing the police, prisons, and the military, end discrimination, torture, and killing of Indigenous women, LGBTQ, Two-Spirit people, full and free access to healthcare, education, social services, and ending or abolishing imperial borders. And the last example I'll give is, there's fighting the state and there's fighting capitalist extraction, but there's also creating alternatives. And so two of my favorite places on the planet are Jackson, Mississippi, and Detroit, where you begin to see the use of land trusts, for example, or the transformation of abandoned lands into mini farms. People like Malik Yakini, who founded and directed Detroit Black Community Food Security Network, is doing amazing work with others in terms of urban farming, growing, which is also, reclaiming the land for organic food and to replace, agribusiness with, community-owned forms of food security. So these are the kinds of things that are already happening. And like I said, like Mia said, and like Myriam said, they need support and resources, and it's up to us to fight for them and to participate. But I will say that you can't do one without the other. We need to stop oil and gas extraction, and we need to create alternative modes of living and take leadership from Indigenous communities as stewards of this land and restore sovereign rights.
Thanks, Robin, for sharing your understanding of that long history, as well as some solutions in terms of how we should be moving forward. I want to go next to Meer. And Meer, you heard Robin, and based on your, your other comments, what else would you share in terms of lessons and opportunities do you see for communities impacted and harmed by institutional racism and to achieve environmental justice and deal with the climate emergencies that can help us address these crises?
Yeah. No, there are a lot of opportunities actually. And I want to thank Robin. Thank you for doing a very quick synopsis of the history of Indigenous people fighting in their own territories and in their own way, and drawing the lines of connection because they're very important. the same lines can be said about the descendants of enslaved people, of these lines of connection, right? And I think that that's really important, is remembering to hold on to what is the framing that we're holding. So lastly, I spoke about the most impacted people, the folks on the front line, those who are experiencing the harm, but also are experiencing the solutions of the harm. And it's not just that we direct resources, it's that we take direction from, right? So let me repeat that again. It's super important that we take direction from communities most impacted. No matter what your degree is, no matter what your background is, including myself, right? Having had the privilege to be in the position to learn tools and skills as an organizer doesn't then give me the right, even as an Indigenous person, to go into a community that is not my own, that I'm a guest in, and not take direction and leadership and invitation from that community in order to understand and support the way forward, right? So it is true that these are also a legal standing in this fight. So a couple things to think about that are really interesting that are happening alongside this climate fight, or as one tactic or tool or strategy. One of the things is looking at the financial system, right? And the financial system is really complicated in order for you not to understand it. Like, let's just be clear. Like, it's not designed for the layperson, the everyday person, to like be like, I get how this works. That's not what it's there for. It's there to be convoluted on purpose, structurally, so that you don't really ask questions. You just kind of go to work and make your money, and then you pay your bills, and hopefully you have some, and you get some credit and get into debt, and all those things. One of the things that when you step back and you look at like this bigger system, right, of who is funding what. Today, I just want to do a name drop of a cool tool that's out there that people can use to look at and understand at a deeper level, at a more intense level of like how, when we say structural racism, white supremacy structures, settler colonialism. Today, we just dropped as one of the members who helped to put this research project together, this report. It's called Banking on Climate Chaos. It's a report that we've released since the Paris Agreement, the Paris Accord. And we released it today. You can go to bankingonclimatechaos.org and look it up. And it names the top 4 banks are US-based banks that are funding, not only nationally funding the structures of climate chaos, internationally, globally, are funding the structures of climate chaos. Chase Bank, Citibank, Bank of America, and Wells Fargo. They are supported by insurers. So the role that insurance companies play at a global and national structure, right, against climate justice, they play an injustice role. They play a role of structural racism, and their role is anti-transformation into the world we want to be in, right? That is sustainable for everyone. So that, and one of the key, and next week I'll be in an action looking at and calling out on the ground other key stakeholders like Liberty Mutual and Chubb, who are ensuring climate chaos, and particularly are backing Arctic fracking, the gas line, the coastal gas line leak, LNG. And so these are the solutions. I'm getting there. I'm getting to the solutions. So these are key parts of the problem, right? But they're really big. And so it's like, if you're every day, I don't think about, the insurance, I'm trying to get the best deal on insurance because I'm trying to figure out how to make my money work. But when I find out that this company that I'm giving just my little pennies to, because to them they're pennies, but feel like a lot to me because I'm working really hard, right, to make those pennies, is funding the very thing that makes it hard for me to exist, that becomes a way in which we can begin to take action and shift the knowledge, shift the knowing, and make it and simplify the language in a way so that everyone has access to understanding that actually you can really massively impact and shift climate chaos and create climate change and sustainability by shifting the way that banking and insurers, and there's another group of financial folks that are called asset managers, where they manage cities and their money and all that. Like if you have a lot of money, you need to have a lot of places where you need pockets that you need to manage. Those guys are called asset managers. One of the big ones is BlackRock. In Boston, we have State Street. They have a lot of say in whether or not these projects go forward, in whether or not these structural harms are allowed to happen. They have a lot of say in signing on to continuing this process. And there are people inside of those structures that are benefiting from the structure and denying the accountability within it. So there's a lot of work that Indigenous communities, as well as other frontline communities, are doing to fight, as well as alongside a lot of our large green climate organizations that are also fighting, right? So this is where we're beginning to pull and put together all the different groups that are recognizing their stake and their claim on this fight and where they can move and how they can move. So I'm saying that because another part of the solution, right? One of the solution is you have to fight. You have to fight the old. You have to fight, and some of that is knowledge. And I say knowledge because we don't. Again, coming into this work, I didn't really think about my banking situation. I'm thinking about surviving. I'm thinking about groceries. I'm thinking about taking care of my kid. I'm thinking about transportation, things I'm tangibly dealing with every day, because every day is hard, right? And that moves into, now I have this knowledge and I'm learning these skills around how my everyday is being determined by people and shareholders in rooms, in infrastructures that are set up with structural racism, behind doors, that are at banks, insurance institutions, and asset manager institutions. And that those institutions are institutions and can be moved. It might take a lot of work, it will, but it can happen. There is leverage, there is possibility. Another solution is like, what happens when you shift out of that? And as we shift, LA County voted as one of the first cities in the country to open a public municipal bank. It's a process, it's been a process. Boston City currently has an ordinance that it is working to push public banking for municipalities. Public banking is a way in which the community has a say-so in how the money is brought in and how the money is going out. It's a little more complicated than that, but that's like the simple verse. Sorry. So with all of that knowledge, there is a possibility of a way forward and an investment of time to make that happen on both ends. We must fight the old and build the new at the same time. Thank you so much.
I'm so grateful for the clarity of your vision, Mia, and the practical force of your critique. That was very, very powerful and extremely, extremely useful. Thank you. So in our final question, Myriam, I'd like to invite you back in and ask you if you could share with us practical examples from your own organizing experience that other communities can learn from, that can lead to systemic change. We welcome whatever insights you might have, please.
Ooh. All right, so whenever we're invited to tell our stories, I think we sometimes have the opportunity to remember that our stories are really like a continuation of the many, many other stories of people whose lives we've intersected with. So it's kind of like getting in a river, not at the headwaters, but somewhere downstream. And that's obviously where our story begins. So I will share some practical examples, and I will just name that these examples are not mine. They are things that I've learned from the tables that I've sat at and the elders and the youth who have helped me to see what is possible when we work to connect with one another. So, you know, I am originally from Cameroon, and the impact and the legacy of colonialism has continued to affect the well-being socially, politically, economically, and many other ways of the people in my community. We have practices for holding each other up, for standing each other up and holding each other together. And those practices have been passed on throughout generations, and they've also been challenged by the sort of losses and impacts. So we're healing that, and that resonates with me. And I remember my stories about my grandfather, Janvier Mbele, who would go hunting and bring whatever he brought to my grandmother, Salome Du, to cut and clean, and then serve abundantly people in the community, because there's nothing like food to create an opportunity for fellowship. And those stories of who I am and where I come from continue to inform how I organize through till today. And of course, a lot of my organizing experience isn't about me being at the lead of the organizing. So I have had the privilege and the opportunity to attend to those who are in the lead or who are leading the charge and are willing to sustain the immediate impacts of, you know, threat to their life and their livelihood by speaking up and being courageous. I think it's important to name that people who are doing this work are impacted by it no matter what, you know, and it's our role that we can play to support and love and care for those who are in the lead, who are at the front of the room, or in the, you know, we like the circle model anyways, we don't like the front of the room anyways, but we have Zoom now, Zoom circles, Zoom ciphers. So, you know, I am a practitioner of Capoeira Angola, and I believe that some of our fight is keeping ourselves healthy enough and strong enough to persist, keeping our hearts healthy, keeping our mind fresh and elastic. So there's a lot of need for learning and studying Indigenous practices and preserving and passing on. So that's one space where I've had the privilege of organizing. Also, I've had the opportunity to work with various elders in my community, supporting their ongoing legacy of making change on the day-to-day, and many of them, you know, years in the paint without being supported and compensated for that work. And I recently coordinated working with a number of people from my community and others, a rites of passage program for young Black men who were led through a process of learning community organizing and stewardship and Kiswahili, and we took them to Mount Kilimanjaro after doing grassroots fundraising to ensure that we could all get there together. We took them and we summited that mountain with all that we had left there at Uhuru Peak. And so all of that happens. And I think the key, and there was a question about how do you work on the local and systemic levels. The key is you work on all the levels and you take what you learn here and you bring it and you translate. And that's what I call translational practice. In terms of climate and learning about climate, we have meetings and convenings and gatherings within the cities network that are focused on learning and presencing what we're learning through our work in the community. And one of the things that we are going to be looking at very closely is the International Panel on Climate Change, on climate change's most recent report, the 6th report. These are narratives, they're like stories that it's important that we become familiar with so that we come to the table having informed our thinking in the community and the things that we're learning there and in those spaces of where this dialogue and these agendas are being set. So we've invited some of the authors and contributing advisors to our conversation, and we'll be engaging them in learning what was their process and how do we position ourselves to influence this agenda regarding climate change, adaptation and mitigation, you know, the greenhouse gases, carbon piece, and then the social infrastructure. And I think ultimately the experience that I have has to do with building the social infrastructure we need to take care of ourselves and the planet. And so one of the ways that I've had the opportunity to do that, and that we'll do more of this year, is working with Dr. Vandermeer and Dr. Jones to bring their expertise, to learn from what individuals are represented in their network as part of a 7-part learning series called The Shift. And we will continue to shift our mindset and our policies and our practices based on learning from those people who have many years doing this work and thinking and writing, and through their scholarship and their activism, can provide examples for us to learn from. So I think I would like to end there and thank, those of us who are working what we call across the aisle. There are no aisles, although there are silos. And the more that we can connect with each other and build and strengthen our networks. I have spent some time, and I invite you also to spend some time, for example, looking at structures like what was the structure of the International Panel for Climate Change. What was the structure of the working groups and the task force and the bureaus and the secretariats? How do we organize so that we can do this work? Because there's enough expertise, there's enough knowledge, and there need to be strengthened relationships, and there need to be stronger pathways for us to exchange knowledge and resources and support so that we can sustain ourselves doing this work and we can support one another in our ongoing efforts. So thank you.
Thank you, Myriam. And we can all put our cameras on if you want. We have about 14 more minutes left, and we wanted to try to engage some questions that we also wanted to, before we end, get a sort of a response from all of the panelists. So I'm not sure if the panelists had any questions or anything they wanted to say in relationship to what was said. And so if that, I think we might have had one question in there, maybe more will populate, but we only have a limited time. But I want to really thank all of you for such a, rich discussion in terms of the what you've brought up for the audience to consider, looking at what the challenges are and opportunities are and how we need to be able to get engaged. There was someone, Mia, who had a question about what's happening with organizations locally. So if you have some ideas, you can put something in the chat for them to get that. So did any of you have any questions or any follow-up that you wanted to respond to? Not hearing none. There was a question for you, Myriam. I don't know if you saw it. Oh,
I did answer in the chat. So if someone
okay. All right. Thank you.
Definitely follow up if there's a specific work they want to look at.
Okay. Professor Max Shelton said that she was curious as to the reaction to the cooperation participation coming from the wider Black community, or were they mostly non-Blacks responding and assisting?
I believe this is directed to me, yes? Yeah. So KV, I'm gonna call you KV. Thank you for that question. And wow, I mean, we definitely inherited unfortunate legacies of plantation mentality here in the South. Oh my goodness. It's not even any small thing. And we have to continuously liberate ourselves from the system. It's not just freeing ourselves from slavery, but like the sister said, from the impacts of enslavement, sorry for that. But the enslavement of our minds, going through public education system and being conditioned by the thinking of what we are surrounded by. And we just have to do differently. And we have to question, we have to be willing, as my elders have taught me, to challenge people and policies and programs that do not serve us. And that with a smile on our face, because it's not about my sort of personal, I'm not empire building. It's not my agenda. This is actually us doing the work, and I will speak up. And so that's what my work in Georgia has looked like, so, your question, sorry, about, the reaction of, no, there's been tables that I have unfortunately tried to bring together that didn't want to work together. And I had to embrace and accept that was actually not a problem. That was okay. And that, there are people who may go between the tables, but not all the tables are going to come together. And, we need to be in those spaces. We need to be talking to the mayor, the director of sustainability, the director of regional planning. Like, we do need to actually talk to them as well. So in terms of the either or, it's usually a both and, where we need to continue to occupy every space and speak up on behalf of what we know and question. And so, yeah, good luck with your work, and reach out if you would like to compare notes.
Thank you, Myriam. Keith, you want to lead us in terms of the final?
Sure. Yeah. I
information?
just, and Robin, I know you got to cut out really, really soon, but we wanted to give everybody an opportunity just to reflect on a takeaway. And I'm wondering, Robin, if you don't mind, knowing how limited your time is, and again, we're so grateful for your presence this evening. Do you mind starting with the takeaway for us?
Sure, I don't mind at all, because I have 3 minutes. The takeaway is always, for me, what I learned in the last hour and 20 minutes. And I just have to say that, I do the work I do, but these sisters who are really here at the forefront, allow me to see well tonight, because I just think that the movement is here. And it just so happens that, and I'm not surprised that at the forefront, this is not new, this is how it's always been. Black women, queer, trans, gender nonconforming, non-binary people have been at the forefront of these struggles, in part because what affects our sort of physical life, usually affects the most vulnerable, and also those who do the most work. Mm-hmm. And one of the things we've learned from groups like Black Women, International Black Women for Wages for Housework, or from Sylvia Federici and others, is that just in terms of from a global scale, when it comes to like farming, when it comes to subsistence work, when it comes to reproductive work, that is the work required to keep ourselves and our communities alive, Black women, women, gender nonconforming people are at the forefront of that. So, I don't have anything to say, but I'm just like, I'm going to follow both Mia and Myriam and just try to figure out everything they do and listen very carefully, and then try to be a good student. But with that, I just want to say goodbye to everyone. Thank you so much. It's great seeing you, Tony, as well, and Keith and everyone. And, solidarity and free the land.
All right. Thanks so much,
Robin. We appreciate you.
Mm-hmm.
Mia, can we turn to you now, please? With a takeaway.
Yeah, absolutely. And it was wonderful sharing space with everyone here, and listening to Robin, and just really deeply appreciate that. Deeply appreciate everyone actively being involved in the chat and listening and taking these words in, and these stories in. Today, I was in a meeting. I shared that they were going to be doing an action in the Bay in the next weeks. And there's a young Indigenous woman who was on the call, and we were talking about some of the imagery for that. And one of the things that she brought up was that she's like, I'm Salmon people, but for generations, my family hasn't had access. And she's like, and because of that, I've been kept apart from my own people in my own way, right? And so I feel like I felt her in this space as we were talking and sharing, and so much of this is ideas. And I really wanted to bring her into this space to look back, to look forward. I really feel like the salmon in this moment is the Sankofa of us going back. I grew up on the coast of Oregon. I saw the run. I know what it means to miss the the things that are yours, the things that are your people, particularly if they are your people inherently, they are your body, they are your water, they are who you are. And to miss that because it's been displaced, it's been removed from you by structural racism and systems of oppression and systems of colonization that are told stories that are not true when there are very direct and clear ways in which you can arbitrate those stories and shift the power and the dynamics. So thank you all for being shifters and for being those who are here to stand in the gap and to fill and to begin to mend. Really appreciate it.
Thank you, Mia.
Yeah, beautiful, Mia. Myriam, take away.
Yeah.
Take us home, Myriam. Take us home.
Hey, if you come home, I might make you some soup.
Well,
I wouldn't mind that right about
I'm
now.
sorry, I keep saying Mia, but Maya's also, she bakes too. So we
Yeah, I
can
know.
some bakery and some soup. So that sounds good to us, right?
All right, all right. And it's Maya, not Mia.
That's
good.
right.
Thank you. Sorry. Yeah.
We've been messing it up all night.
Yeah, it's Mia.
It's Mia.
Yeah, it's not May or Maya, it's still Mia, but it's cool. I'm
Okay.
Yeah, we still want to get that pastry, so.
Yeah, well, it looks like we have a future. I'll bake some bread and we'll break bread. I really appreciated co-presenting with you, Mia, and appreciated your focus on a couple of things. One, the piece on healing. I mean, I am healing. There's a lot of healing to do, you know, and we stand and we are proud and we are courageous and we are healing. So I really appreciate that. And I really appreciate your speaking on economics, because I will say that my trajectory has been, you know, coming from a place where, you know, my mother finished 6th grade and, you know, mostly didn't wear shoes, and money wasn't the currency, right? It was something else. And my grandmother's ability to understand how to manipulate the herbs and to help the pregnant women and the people who were sick, that was a currency. And you have to learn money. You have to learn money. And not because we want to be like those who have extracted wealth from our communities, but I cannot underscore enough. I mean, for fun, the other day, I pulled up a Schedule C, which is the tax document that businesses have to submit. There's so much learning in that one tax document, you know. So I just want to say that, like, when people are speaking, there's often signals, they're pointing you, look, I've been down that road, learn, go down there, because there's something down there for you. And finances, you know, not just individual, but also at TNC, we do a lot of work to, to re-grant to community organizations for operations, not to tie, you know, some of the granting that happens, and the KV might appreciate this, but some of the re-granting that happens by way of foundations pulls at the purse strings and tells you what you need to do, but we need to be more transformative in how we give and how we resource. And so I do want to thank all the people from the Nature Conservancy who showed up today, because I think it, like I said, represents a willingness to get outside of our institutional boundaries and to be in community wherever we can and to learn from one another. And the Nature Conservancy does have a lot of room to grow. And there are individuals who are courageously working within that space to presence earth honoring principles. And I'm really appreciative of them and all of what they bring there and all the people doing the work. So thank you, Baba Tony and then Dr. Jones. Appreciate you and the Sustainable Solutions Lab for bringing us together tonight.
Well, thank you, Myriam, and thank you, Mia. Maya, I'm gonna get it straight. You know, we're working with someone else, and we've been making this mistake with her and with you, so we apologize. But thank you so much for what you brought in the space today and shared with us. And you know, as Robin said, you know, this is an important space for us to share and to learn from those of you who are on the ground and doing this work, and that we need to open up more spaces like this to learn from you. And so we really appreciate you sacrificing your time today to come on and share with our community. And so we look forward to doing more work together with both of you, along with Robin, so we can continue this work. So thanks so much. We appreciate you. We love you. And Gabrielle, if you would stay on as people begin to go off, and if you want to, you could put some of Alice Coltrane back on as we leave.
Yeah. Again, thank you all. And thank you all for being in community with us this evening. We appreciate you.
Good night, everyone.